So today, I want to talk about something, and it's a topic that all of us are familiar with right now in our nation. There's just a lot of racial tension going on. A lot of talk about racism and that issue. And I was praying about what to preach on, and I felt like the Lord put this on my heart, and so I wanted to just talk to you about it. This is not, however, I want to make it clear. I don't know why this keeps turning. I want to make this clear. This is not a message for you to look at your neighbor and go, boy, I hope you're paying attention, or call up your somebody or that you know and like, man, you need to listen to this message. I know you need it. I didn't need it, but you needed it. That's not the heart of this message. I think all of us need to pay attention to what's being taught today. Okay? Because the reality is that treating other races with less respect and love than they deserve is a problem that we all have to wrestle with on some level. I really do believe that. I think all of us have to wrestle with that on some level. But how do we cure this problem of racism? I think all of us would agree we want to eliminate it. I don't think there's anybody in here that says, nope, let's keep it the way it is. Let's keep going. This is good. No. I think all of us would say, yeah, we want to get rid of this. We want to do away with it. But the problem is it's a very complex issue. When you really stop to think about it, how do we resolve it? How do we solve this? My wife and I were at a party at our house, and a birthday party, and the conversation turned to this issue. And it was an uncomfortable conversation. There was two sides, and I remember stopping and thinking, there's some truth on this side, and there's some truth on this side, and it's like, how do we fix this? And I just realized it was just so complex. I don't think there was any one right program, any one right answer from what we were discussing. And it was frustrating to me. And I'm sure you feel frustrated too. How do we take care of this? What do we do? Well, I think that as I was praying about what to preach on in this message, I asked the Lord, I said, okay, if you want me to talk about this, Lord, what do I say? What do I say? What would you teach, Jesus? And I began to think about that. I said, okay, what would you teach if you were here right now in this time of history? And of course he is here. We believe that. But what I meant was physically here, walking with your disciples in this time in history. What would you teach? What would you preach? And something came to my mind, and it's something Jesus did preach. He taught a valuable truth that I think if we followed it would eliminate. In fact, I know if we followed it, it would eliminate racism, prejudice, treating other races as less than themselves. Let me share with you what Jesus taught. One day Jesus was approached by a Jewish man who was a religious teacher. And the religious teacher wanted to test Jesus' knowledge. They were always trying to test him, kind of trip him up, see if he really knew his stuff. He was just a carpenter's son, right? He shouldn't know much. So they were always trying to test him. And this is what he asked Jesus. And it says this in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 28. He says this, one day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question, Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied, well, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Jesus told him. I love this part. Do this and you'll live. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the key to destroying racism. Loving your neighbor as yourself. That simple yet profound command has the power to destroy racism if we simply apply it to our lives. To love your neighbor as yourself means that you treat people around you the way you would want to be treated. If you want respect, then you show respect. If you want love, goodness, mercy, grace, then that's what you show. Right? Because you're treating people like you would want them to treat you. Isn't that profound? Simple. I could stop right here, right? Simple, but powerful. You know, we may feel frustrated because we can't change everybody in the world. But the truth is, if you want to change the world, you have to start with you first. We have to be the change before we can see the change. The Jewish leader, the Jewish teacher that was testing Jesus, he heard what Jesus said and he kind of goes, you know what, that sounds great, but you know, he kind of wanted to push back against Jesus. He kind of felt a little, I honestly think he felt a little guilty, a little like, you know, I don't know if I like what you're saying right now. And so he tries to push back at Jesus and says, oh yeah, well, who's my neighbor? Now Jesus saw through this man's question, because what this man wanted is he wanted to define the term neighbor to a specific group of people, his people. People that were like him, Jewish people. He wanted Jesus to support and agree with his position that the people we are to love, our neighbors, are the people who are like us. Our own people group. And I think all of us would agree that's easier, right? Because it's easier to like things that you're used to, you're comfortable with. Different things that are different, that bothers us. It makes us uncomfortable. So that's what this man wanted. He wanted Jesus to help him to define the neighbor as his people group so that he could treat them with love, but everybody else he could treat with less love. He could treat as worth less. I think this is all something that we all have to wrestle with. We don't like things that are different. Different bothers us, makes us uncomfortable. So we prefer to stay in a situation where we feel comfortable. But when we turn around and we look down on anything or anyone who is different than us, and we treat them as worth less than us, then we have not lived up to this command. But what's interesting about this is Jesus picks up on all this. And you know, when I first, this phrase, this command came to my mind as I was asking the Lord to help me to understand what to preach. And it was this simple, love your neighbor as yourself. I was like, well, that's great. That's really simple, God. I don't think I'm going to get a whole message out of that, but hey, you know, that's great. And then all of a sudden it came to me what Jesus said after this. The story that he told after he said this. I love this because he deals with racism after he talks about loving your neighbor as yourself. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Let me just give you a little bit of background. Samaritans were hated by the Jews. Right? The hatred started several hundred years earlier than this story. At one time, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, they kept the name Israel, the kingdom of Israel. And they made the capital of their city or their kingdom was Samaria. Okay? The other kingdom was called the kingdom of Judah, right? So there's the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and then there's the kingdom of Judah, right? They're both made up of Jewish people, right? And Judah's capital city was the city of Jerusalem. Now here's what happened. In 722 BC, Assyria attacked the northern kingdom of Israel. They conquered it and they took most of the people captive, but they left some people. They left what's called a remnant that lived in that northern kingdom. Remember, that's where the capital city of Samaria is, right? The Assyrians, what they did is they then sent colonists from all different nationalities and religions to resettle that land in the northern kingdom, right? And what happens is they began to influence the remnant. Not only that, but they began to intermarry with them. So they became this mixed race. There was some Jewish blood, if you want to say that, or a Jewish race within them, but there was a mixture of other races. Not only that, but they introduced new religions. So this remnant began to not only, they kept worshiping the one God, but they kind of mixed him in with a lot of other religions. So it's kind of like, yeah, we worship, Yahweh, we worship God, but we also kind of worship Baal and all these other gods as well. So they became this mixed race people known as the Samaritans. Now here's what happened. A little over 100 years later, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, was conquered by a different nation called Babylon. And they too were taken captive. But then most, if not all of them were taken captive. But what happens is in Babylon, they sent back like 4,300 or 43,000 full-blooded Jews were allowed to re-enter and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. But when they tried to rebuild, the mixed-race Samaritans tried to stop them. So the full-blooded Jews who worshiped the one God hated the mixed-race Samaritans and their worship of many gods. And that hatred went on and on for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was so bad, they wouldn't even talk to each other. They would have nothing to do with each other. So this Jewish, keeping that in mind, what happens is the Jewish religious leader asked Jesus to define who his neighbor is. Keeping in mind that the Samaritans are hated. They are despised, they're looked down on. And he says, okay, Jesus, tell me who my neighbor is. And this is what Jesus says. He says this. He says, the man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. This is a priest of the Jewish religion, works in the temple. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Here he sees one of his own people. He himself is Jewish, and he sees this man who is Jewish, and he's beaten, and he walks on by. Then a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Here are these godly men, right? They work in the temple. You can imagine they're like pastors, assistant pastors, all that kind of stuff. And they see someone of their own race lying, beaten, robbed on the side of the road. They go over, they look, and they're like, wow, look at that. That's horrible. Right? Man, glad it's not me. And then they keep on walking. Then, I love this, what Jesus says here. Then a despised Samaritan. Jesus doesn't pull punches. He says, then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now this is what Jesus says. He says, now which one of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. You almost get a sense that this guy, he's grinding his teeth as he says this, you know? Because he doesn't want to say it. But he knows it's the truth, and he knows there's a crowd, and everybody knows who the hero of the story is. It's pretty obvious. And it's like he just has to spit it out and says, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said this, yes, now go and do the same. You see, the Jewish teacher wanted Jesus to define the term neighbor by a group of people. But Jesus didn't define the term neighbor by a group of people. Instead, he defines what the love of a neighbor looks like. And his definition goes something like this. Real love is treating everyone like you want to be treated. You know what's amazing on this? I love this. The hero of this story wasn't the Jewish priest or the temple assistant. The hero of the story was a despised Samaritan. The Samaritan was Jesus' model for loving your neighbor as yourself. If you want to know how to love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus is saying you need to look to the Good Samaritan. He is our model. He's the hero. I want to take a moment and I want to look at some of the things we can learn from the Samaritan about how to love our neighbor as ourselves and how we can combat racism. And the first thing that I think stands out to me from this story and what the Samaritan did is when he saw the Jewish beaten man, he had compassion on him. He had compassion on this Jewish man because he empathized with his pain. He put himself in his shoes and asked, if I was that man, what would I want someone to do for me? He put himself in his shoes. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of everyone we come across, regardless of their race. When you put yourself in someone else's shoes, you begin to see them as equal to you. And that's what loving your neighbor is really all about, isn't it? Loving your neighbor as yourself. It's seeing the other person as someone just like you, as equal to you. and then treating them how you would want to be treated. Instead of seeing someone as different, we need to start seeing our similarities. Instead of seeing someone of a different race as different, weird, whatever, we need to start seeing our similarities. One of the similarities we all share among the races is we are all God's creation. And as I've taught my sons many times, and I know I've listened to myself, is that God doesn't make junk. Is that not true? You know, that's something that I remind myself often when I deal with insecurities. That God doesn't make junk. I think you probably would do the same. When you're thinking about yourself, God doesn't make junk. He didn't make a mistake when He made me. But we need to start turning that around and looking at other people and saying, you know what? They are God's creation. And God doesn't make junk. He didn't make a mistake when He made them. How can we obey the very first commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, if we treat the people He created and loves like they are worthless? We need to treat everyone with the same respect and love that we would want them to show us. Now you might say, but Pastor, you don't know what kind of mistreatment and pain I've experienced from other races. I can tell you some stories. Pastor, I can tell you stories of this people group did this to me, or this people group did that to me. But what I want you to see from this Samaritan is something impressive, something from this story that's amazing to me. I didn't really think of it until I was studying for this message, that there are really two victims in this story. The first victim is the Jewish man who was beaten. But the often overlooked victim is the Samaritan himself. You see, Jesus Himself describes him as a despised Samaritan. A despised Samaritan. The Samaritan was despised by the Jewish people. He was looked at as less than human. He was treated like garbage. He could probably tell you stories of how he himself was mistreated at the hands of Jewish people. He could probably tell you stories about how his grandmother or grandfather or his uncle or his sister were mistreated by the Jewish people. He was a victim of racism. The Samaritan had pain. The Jewish man had pain. There was pain on both sides. There's pain on both sides of this issue of racism today in our nation. Each group has experienced being mistreated and hurt by the other side. But what's amazing is that the Samaritan didn't focus on his pain. He chose to reach past his own pain and show love to someone else who was in pain. He chose to love his neighbor, this Jewish man, like he would want someone to love him. And you know what's amazing? He didn't just go halfway. He didn't just kind of put a Band-Aid on him and pat him on the head and say, hey, it'll be okay. He made great sacrifices for this Jewish man. You know what's interesting is that's the kind of love that God teaches us to show other people, right? It's the kind of love where we love even our enemies. Isn't that what Jesus taught us? Love your enemies. Do good to those who have hurt you. This Samaritan, he chose to be the change. He was a hero. I'm amazed at the Samaritan. I look up to him. He didn't focus on his pain. He didn't go, you know what? These Jewish people, all they've done is hurt me, my family, everything. But you know what? I'm just going to walk on by. This guy, he gets what he deserves. I want to show you a picture in just a moment. Caleb, if you can have that up and ready. I was reading a story and in the news, and I was just amazed. I don't know if you have heard this story, but during the riots, this police officer, white police officer, was separated from his unit. And these, I think it's 4 African American men, they guarded him during the riots until he could reconnect with his unit. They wouldn't let anybody come and hurt him. They protected him. I love that. They looked past their pain and they said, if I was that man, what would I want someone to do for me? And they did it. They were heroes, just like the Samaritan. We need to look past our own pain. I don't know what kind of pain you have today. I don't know what kind of a pain you've experienced in your life. But if we're going to change the world, we have to change ourselves first. And we can't just focus on our pain. We've got to reach past our pain and choose to love. Love our neighbor as ourselves. Pastor Kim, would you come? The question today is, are you willing to be the change?